I learned an important lesson about trust in the military from one of my young soldiers in 1982. We were out for a morning formation, getting ready to do the weekly battalion run, and it was a typical German morning, cold, foggy, and I knew that we had 2 soldiers from our battalion that were AWOL, absent without leave. And I knew that one of them was in our company, Combat Support Company. So my company commander was the first to give the report. He says, Combat Support Company has 1 man AWOL. And then I listened as the next 4 companies all reported, A company, all present, B company, all present, C company, all present, headquarters company, all present. And I thought to myself, that can't be. I know there's at least 1 other soldier that's AWOL. And then right behind me, in the loudest stage whisper I've ever heard, Specialist Anthony DeChico of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania said, "Sir, do you think one of those other sons of bitches is lying?" It stuck with me for the rest of my professional life that soldiers know if their officers are honest. They know the importance of trust. They trust in their leaders, they trust in the purpose of what they're doing, and they trust that everyone else is going to do everything they can to help them be successful. That's why trust matters. After the fall of Lehman, there has been a cacophony of Russian generals and other experts complaining about what happened. One of the complaints came from a senior retired Russian general where he talked about everyone was lying. Lying has been going on up and down the chain of command inside the Russian Federation forces. False reporting, the status of forces, the location of forces. One of the reasons I overestimated Russian capabilities before 24 February this year was because I failed to understand or realize the depth of corruption inside the Ministry of Defense. That's been a major contributor to the collapse of Russian forces here over the last 6 weeks. Ukrainian armed forces have achieved what I believe is irreversible momentum. There are ample examples of the lack of will on the side of Russian forces as well as the Russian people, as evidenced by the hundreds of thousands of military-aged males that have fled out of Russia as fast as they can to avoid being mobilized. I remain confident that Ukrainian forces are going to push Russian forces back to the 23 February line before the end of this year, and that by the middle of summer next year, 2023, Ukrainian forces will be in control of the Crimean Peninsula. I think there are 3 things that have happened in the last few weeks that indicate perhaps we're entering a new phase of this war. The first one, call for a partial mobilization of hundreds of thousands of reservists to go into Russian armed forces. The second one was the conduct of sham referenda in 4 oblasts about whether people wanted to vote to leave Ukraine and become part of Russia. And then the third was a conclusion of those referenda, predetermined of course, where the Kremlin announces that all 4 of these provinces now are annexed and are part of Russia. I think that all 3 of these indicate that the Kremlin acknowledges that the situation is deteriorating, that they're in real trouble. And so the results include several things such as mixed messaging coming out of the Kremlin. I mean, such a momentous announcement as partial mobilization of hundreds of thousands of people, you would think this would have been prepared, well coordinated, the nation would have been ready for it. Instead, the message that came out of the Kremlin was very mixed, very garbled, incoherent almost, and then therefore the implementation of this mobilization has been sloppy and not at all well received by the Russian population. In fact, hundreds of thousands of military-aged men have done everything they can to avoid it. They absolutely do not want to be there. The referenda about whether or not the people of these 4 oblasts, Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Kherson, wanted to become part of Russia, is seen around the entire world as a sham. Nobody believes that these are legitimate. Secretary General of the United Nations has said so. Heads of other international organizations have said so. And importantly, heads of state have said so. Nobody will recognize these. Nonetheless, the Kremlin drove ahead and declared that these 4 provinces were now annexed and part of Russia. Of course, the reason for doing this is to make some justification to the Russian people why they have to do a mobilization now to defend this new territory of Russia. It also has aroused some anxiety in some places that Is this a way for the Kremlin to justify the use of a nuclear weapon? It's long been stated that any attack on the motherland, any threat to the existence of the motherland, would be justification for the use of a nuclear weapon. But I still think it's unlikely that they would use a nuclear weapon. First, it gives them no battlefield advantage. A tactical nuclear weapon is only useful if it creates an opportunity for exploitation, for Russian forces to move through a gap that was created, or to follow up on the results of a tactical nuclear weapon being exploded somewhere. They have nobody with which to exploit it. There is no follow-on force. There is no second echelon that could come take advantage of that. So there's no battlefield advantage. There's no upside to using a tactical nuclear weapon. There are only downsides. The Kremlin knows that if they were to use a nuclear weapon, it would be impossible for the United States to stay out of direct confrontation. If Russia uses a tactical nuclear weapon, the United States will have to respond, because can Russia use a nuclear weapon and not suffer the consequences? Now, of course, I don't know what that response will be, but clearly the Pentagon will have drawn up a list of options for the president to use, ranging from kinetic to non-kinetic, nuclear, non-nuclear, or maybe some sort of combination, depending on what the Russian action was. I would expect it would be a proportional response. I would also expect that it would be done in such a way that does not automatically lead to escalation. I would also expect that the president or that the White House would do this in consultation with allies, because allies would be affected by such a response. Now, the Kremlin knows all this. They understand that if the United States responds, it will have devastating consequences for Russian Federation forces. An example could be destruction of what's left of the Black Sea Fleet, or maybe destruction of the Russian Navy base in Tartus in Syria, or maybe destruction of several other important Russian facilities inside Ukraine. So while President Putin is evil, I don't believe he is suicidal. More importantly, I don't believe the people around him are suicidal. And I think it is very important for us now in this critical phase that we are communicating to those people around Putin who keep him in power to say, look, if you think you have any hope for life after Putin in the post-conflict era of getting back to some sort of normalcy, you will make sure that Vladimir Putin does not use a nuclear weapon. So our target for convincing people that Russia should not use the nuclear weapon has to be those in his inner circle, so that they understand what the consequences are. Let's talk for a minute about the mobilization. I think this mobilization is going to end up being another in a long line of strategic mistakes by the Kremlin in the conduct of this war. The U.S. Army, minimum 10 weeks for basic training. That's to turn a civilian into a soldier, give them some physical fitness, learn how to use a weapon, learn how to put on their equipment, understand how orders work. So if the Russians use anything like that model, it's at least 2 or 3 months before any of these new soldiers begin to have any sort of effect on the battlefield. I don't think the Russians are going to wait 10 weeks. I think we are already seeing reports of some of these men being sent forward already. So what are they trying to do? This is about trading bodies for time. The Russians are going to sacrifice thousands of young men and some older men to buy time, to try to thicken their lines, to slow down Ukrainian offensive, to string this out, to make the war last longer. It's also important as we look at the map to keep in mind that this Ukrainian counteroffensive that started back in the first week of September, all the things that are happening from Kharkiv in the north around to Kherson in the south, these are all part of one operation. And pretty soon, you can imagine that Svatov is going to be captured. This is the only rail hub that would enable north-south lateral movement down towards even places that it couldn't imagine talking about until a few weeks ago, Donetsk and Mariupol. Kherson, of course, has a huge amount of Russian forces on the right side of the Dnipro River. Ukrainians are being very methodical here. They're being patient. There's no need to get into a big giant fight inside the city of Kherson. It's a Ukrainian city. Thousands of Ukrainian citizens live there. The Ukrainians don't want to destroy it. I think what the Ukrainians are doing, of course, is keeping these Russian troops fixed there so that they cannot escape. And at some point, Ukrainians will have set the conditions. They'll be ready to bypass the Russians inside Kherson and create another pocket where they're either killed captured, destroyed, and then Ukrainian forces can continue to move closer towards the Crimean Peninsula. All roads lead to Crimea. Ukraine has irreversible momentum. They are going to defeat Russian forces on the battlefield. This is the last winter. So as we wrap up today's conversation, three things really stand out for me. Number one, the combination of Russia's sham referenda, illegal annexation, and partial mobilization indicate that they know they're in trouble. And Putin is desperate to try and salvage this situation and also to preserve his regime. That gives us hope. Number two, this is going to be a hard winter. We know it's going to be a hard winter, and it's going to be expensive, but it's going to be the last winter if we stick together and we continue to support the incredibly brave women and men of Ukrainian armed forces. Number three, what comes next? Capture the city of Liman, another breakthrough, further collapse of Russian Federation forces. What's the end game? I believe that all roads lead to Crimea. Everything that's happening now is pointing towards movement of Ukrainian forces successfully towards the Crimean Peninsula. President Zelensky said the war started in Crimea and it's going to end in Crimea. My name is Ben Hodges, and I look forward to seeing you next time.